On a spring morning in 1979, a maid at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel let herself into a suite on the top floor and found a small, frail woman lying still in bed. The woman weighed under 70 pounds. Her jewelry was mostly gone by then, sold off piece by piece over 3 decades to men who took it and left. Her bank account held less than $4,000. 40 years earlier, that same woman had been called the richest girl on earth. Her name was Barbara Woolworth Hutton, granddaughter of the man who built the five-and-dime empire that put a store called Woolworth's on practically every main street in America. She inherited a fortune worth, in today's money, somewhere north of $500 million. She had furs from Paris, a fleet of homes on 3 continents, a private railway car, and by the time she turned 21, more money than most countries' treasuries. Newspapers gave her a nickname that stuck for the rest of her life, the poor little rich girl. She earned that nickname before she'd married anyone, before the 7 husbands, before the palace in Tangier and the one in Mexico built to look like a Japanese emperor's retreat, before Cary Grant walked her down an aisle and, alone among her husbands, walked away asking for nothing. What happened to Barbara Hutton is not really a story about money, even though money sits at the center of every scene. It's a story about a 9-year-old girl who was told, by the one person she trusted, that nobody would ever love her for herself. And it's a story about how 7 marriages, one after another, proved that warning right. Stick with this one. Her 3rd husband alone is worth the wait. The one man out of 7 who didn't come for the fortune, and the one marriage that ended, strangely, as the only clean divorce of her life. Before we get into husband number 1, hit subscribe if you're new here. We cover the women history remembers as scandals but rarely as people. The heiresses, the widows, the wives who paid for their families' fortunes with their own lives. Barbara Hutton's story is one of the strangest and saddest in that whole catalogue, and there's a lot more where this came from. To understand how a 5-year-old girl ended up as the punchline of a nation's resentment, and decades later, as a cautionary tale whispered about in tabloids on 3 continents, you have to go back before any of the husbands, before the jewelry auctions, before the palace built to look like a Japanese emperor's retreat. You have to go back to a New York apartment in 1917, and a marriage that was already falling apart long before Barbara was old enough to understand what a marriage even was. The girl who found the body. Barbara was 5 years old when her mother, Edna Woolworth Hutton, died in the family's New York apartment. The official cause was listed as suffocation brought on by mastoiditis, an ear infection gone wrong. Almost everyone around the family believed something else. Edna's husband, Franklin Hutton, was a serial philanderer who barely bothered to hide it, and the whispers said Edna had swallowed poison rather than face another affair. The coroner decided no autopsy was necessary. Nobody pushed the question. Barbara found her. A 4-year-old, alone in a room with her dead mother, is not a detail a biography can gloss over, and it isn't one this video will gloss over either. It shaped everything that came next. A father who all but vanished from her life, a childhood spent being shuffled between relatives and governesses, and a girl who grew up richer than royalty and more unwanted than an orphan. There was no funeral scene where a grieving father gathered his daughter close. Franklin Hutton had spent years running around on Edna, and after her death he seemed, by every account left behind, more interested in stepping away from the whole situation than in staying to raise the child at its center. Barbara was handed off. For stretches of her early childhood she lived with her aunt, Marjorie Merriweather Post, the serial heiress who was briefly married to Barbara's uncle, Edward Francis Hutton. Post's own daughter, the actress Dina Merrill, grew up alongside Barbara during those years, and later said on television, decades afterward, that Barbara simply didn't have anywhere else to go. Nobody in the family had volunteered. She was absorbed the way an obligation gets absorbed, not the way a child gets welcomed. Frank Woolworth, her grandfather, had built the family fortune from nothing, a struggling farm boy from upstate New York, who opened a 5-cent store in 1878, and eventually ran a chain of more than 1,000 of them across the country. When he died in 1919, and then when Barbara's grandmother Jenny died 5 years later, tens of millions of dollars funneled down to Barbara, the only grandchild of that line. Franklin Hutton, her father, took control of the money as trustee. He did not take control of raising his daughter. He grew that trust fund aggressively and competently over the following decade. By Barbara's 21st birthday, it had swelled past $40 million, a number that made him, whatever his failures as a parent, extremely good at the one part of fatherhood he'd chosen to keep. At 9 years old, Barbara's own butler pulled her aside and told her something she would repeat, bitterly, for the rest of her life, that she might grow up to be the richest girl in the world, and all that meant was that men would want to marry her for the money. He wasn't wrong. He was, if anything, generous in how he put it. The debut that backfired. By 1930, Franklin Hutton had grown Barbara's trust to roughly $42 million, and he decided her 18th birthday deserved a coming-out party worthy of it. The Ritz-Carlton in New York hosted a debutante ball that cost $60,000, a jaw-dropping figure at any time, and an almost unthinkable one in the depths of the Great Depression, when unemployment lines wrapped around city blocks a few miles from the hotel. Rudy Vallee performed. Maurice Chevalier performed. The Astors and Rockefellers came. Photographers captured Barbara in diamonds while, outside, men sold apples on street corners for a nickel. The backlash was immediate and vicious. Newspapers ran the ball photos next to breadline photos, sometimes on the same page, sometimes with no caption needed to make the comparison land. Barbara Hutton became, almost overnight, a national symbol of everything wrong with inherited wealth, a punching bag for a country that was furious, and had every right to be. Editorial cartoonists drew her in furs standing over soup lines. Letters to newspaper editors demanded to know why a girl who'd never worked a day in her life deserved diamond earrings, while men who'd worked their whole lives stood in the cold for bread. Her father shipped her off to Europe to let the scandal cool, the same instinct that had shaped her whole childhood. When something became inconvenient, remove Barbara from the room, rather than deal with what had actually happened. It never really did cool. The nickname followed her onto every boat, into every marriage, and eventually into her own obituary. She would spend the rest of her life as a symbol before she was ever treated as a person, and the 18-year-old girl standing in diamonds at the Ritz-Carlton had no say in which one the public decided to see. CTA, early. Quick pause before we get into her first marriage, because this one moves fast, and it's easy to lose track of which prince, which count, and which playboy did what to her. If you want the full arc of these 7 marriages without missing a beat, subscribe now and turn on notifications. That way you'll catch the rest of this series the moment it goes up. And if you've got a guess for which husband was the cruelest of the 7, drop it in the comments before we get there. Most people get it wrong. The cousin who introduced her to Seconal. Before any husband entered the picture, there was Jimmy Donahue, Barbara's cousin, the son of another Woolworth daughter, and by most accounts one of the most reckless young men in a family that already had its share. Donahue had grown up with the same unearned fortune and none of the caution that Barbara, at least in her early years, still carried. He introduced her, during her teenage years, to Seconal, the barbiturate that would follow her for the rest of her life, long after every husband had come and gone. Compared to Donahue, contemporaries later said, Barbara had actually arrived as the more grounded of the two. That says less about Barbara's stability and more about how far Donahue's own recklessness ran. It's a small detail in a story crowded with bigger ones, but it matters. Barbara Hutton's later dependence on sedatives didn't arrive with her first violent husband or her first divorce. It arrived earlier, inside her own family, offered casually by a relative who saw nothing wrong with it. By the time the marriages started, the habit was already years old. Husband number 1, the fake prince. Europe is where Barbara met Alexis Mdivani, a self-declared Georgian prince whose family had fled the Soviet takeover of Georgia a decade earlier. The Mdivani siblings had built a minor European legend around themselves as impoverished nobility, charming their way into rich marriages one after another. Alexis's own sister had already married an American heiress from the Astor line. Barbara married Alexis in 1933, at 21 years old, the exact age her trust fund matured. The timing wasn't subtle. Reports at the time pegged his wedding gift from her at roughly $1 million, on top of jewelry and a fleet of cars that arrived almost as soon as the ink dried. Society pages covered the wedding in Paris as though it were a coronation, full of borrowed titles and rented grandeur, and almost nobody at the time asked the obvious question: what, exactly, had Alexis Madivani brought to this marriage, besides the word prince, and a family reputation for finding heiresses? The marriage lasted less than 2 years. Madivani was controlling and repeatedly unfaithful, and by 1935 Barbara had had enough. She paid handsomely to end it. Some accounts put the divorce settlement north of $2 million, and walked away having learned nothing yet about the pattern she'd just started. If anything, the ease of the exit may have taught her the wrong lesson, that a marriage gone wrong could always be solved with a large enough check. Madivani died the following year, in a car crash in Spain, driving a car Barbara had given him. He was 30 years old. His sister, who had married into the Astor family through the same borrowed nobility playbook, outlived him by decades, still working the same circuit of wealthy Americans looking to marry into a European title that, by then, barely existed anywhere outside a passport stamp. Husband number 2, the one who hospitalized her. If Madivani was a warning sign, Count Kurt von Haugwitz-Reventlow was the disaster itself. Barbara married the Danish-German count in 1935, and this marriage produced her only child, a son named Lance, born in 1936. It also produced the worst violence of her life. Reventlow was, by multiple accounts, physically abusive to a degree that eventually hospitalized her and drew police involvement. Friends who visited her during those years described a woman who flinched, who wore long sleeves regardless of season, who stopped hosting the kind of open, lavish gatherings she'd once thrown as a teenager. In 1937, Reventlow pressured Barbara into renouncing her American citizenship in favor of a Danish one, ostensibly for tax reasons tied to her fortune, a decision that would haunt her decades later, when she tried, and failed, to reclaim US citizenship, even as an old woman living out her final years in Beverly Hills. They divorced in 1938. Barbara won custody of Lance, and for the rest of her life, whatever else collapsed around her, she fought to keep her son close. By this point in her 20s, Barbara Hutton had already survived a violent marriage, a public humiliation as a teenager, and the childhood trauma of finding her mother's body. She had also developed 2 habits that would define the rest of her life: a dependence on the barbiturate Seconal, first introduced to her as a teenager by her cousin Jimmy Donahue, and a pattern of extreme dieting that crossed, by any modern clinical standard, into anorexia. Both would follow her to her deathbed, and both, in their own quiet way, did more lasting damage than any single husband managed. Husband number 3, Cary Grant. Here's the marriage everyone actually remembers her for, and it's the one that breaks the pattern completely. Barbara met Cary Grant in Hollywood during the early years of the Second World War, when she was raising money for the Free French forces and using her name to sell war bonds. Grant was already one of the biggest stars in American film. They married in 1942, and the press, never able to resist a headline, dubbed them Cash and Cary. The label was cruel, and it was also backward. Grant was already independently wealthy from his own film career, and by every account from people who knew the couple, he insisted on a prenuptial agreement that protected her money rather than his own. When they divorced in 1945, after 3 years of a marriage strained by Grant's discomfort with Hutton's wealth and social circle, he left with nothing. No settlement, no alimony, none of her jewelry. Of Barbara Hutton's 7 husbands, Cary Grant is the only one who walked away from the marriage with less than he'd had walking in. Grant reportedly cared for her more than the tabloids ever gave him credit for. He was reserved by nature, uncomfortable with the constant swirl of European titles and old money that surrounded Barbara's social circle, and friends of the couple later said the marriage strained less from any betrayal and more from 2 people who simply lived in different registers: a Hollywood professional used to earning his own money, and an heiress who had never once had to think about earning anything. Their divorce, finalized in 1945, was, by the low bar Hutton's marriages had already set, remarkably amicable. No lawsuits, no public accusations, no settlement fights splashed across front pages. Grant went back to his career, and decades later, when journalists asked him about the marriage, he tended to speak of Barbara with a gentleness that stood out against everything the other 6 husbands had left behind. Husband number 4, the Russian racer. In 1947, 2 years after Grant, Barbara married Prince Igor Trubetskoy, a Russian aristocrat who'd lost his family's fortune to the Bolshevik Revolution decades earlier, and made a name for himself instead as a race car driver. He piloted the first Ferrari ever entered in the Monaco Grand Prix. The marriage was quieter and shorter than the ones before it, and Trubetskoy filed for divorce in 1951. What followed was darker than any divorce filing could capture. Not long after the split, Barbara attempted suicide, and the attempt made headlines around the world. One more private catastrophe turned into public spectacle. Exactly the way her mother's death had been. Exactly the way her debutante ball had been. Reporters camped outside the hospital. Papers ran the story next to society page photos from years earlier. The same diamonds, the same furs, framed now as evidence of a woman who had everything and still couldn't want to live. She was not yet 40 years old and had already been called the richest woman alive, the poor little rich girl, a battered wife, and now a suicide risk splashed across front pages from New York to London. 3 more marriages still lay ahead of her. CTA, middle. If you're finding this as gripping as I think you are, now's a good time to like the video. It genuinely helps a small channel like this reach more people who'd want to see it, and it costs you nothing. We've still got 3 more husbands to go, including the one who might be the biggest womanizer in this entire story, and the one who finally showed her what her fortune had actually turned her into. Stay with us. Husband number 5, the playboy who bankrupted 2 heiresses. If there's a villain in this story, aside from Barbara's own family and the men who abused her, it's Porfirio Rubirosa. The Dominican diplomat and professional playboy had already been married to Doris Duke, heiress to the American tobacco fortune and, not coincidentally, Barbara's own rival for the title of richest woman in America. Duke's divorce settlement to Rubirosa reportedly included sports cars, polo ponies, a Dominican plantation, a converted B-25 bomber, a 17th-century Paris townhouse, and a lifetime annual payment of $25,000. Duke herself reportedly paid Rubirosa's next wife $1 million simply to agree to the divorce. Barbara married him in 1953, and by then the 2 women's rivalry had become an open joke in the gossip pages. Doris Duke and Barbara Hutton, the 2 richest heiresses in the country, both married at different points to the same charming Dominican diplomat who left each of them poorer and more publicly humiliated than he'd found them. When Barbara's marriage to Rubirosa ended a single year later, in 1954, she gave him $3.5 million and, in an almost absurd echo of Duke's settlement, another converted B-25 bomber of his own. 2 of the wealthiest women alive had now each handed the same man a literal airplane on their way out the door, and neither of them seemed to have compared notes beforehand. Husband number 6, the tennis baron. In 1955, Barbara married Baron Gottfried von Cramm, a German tennis champion who had once been ranked among the best players in the world. This marriage lasted longer than most of her others, 4 years, until 1959, but it followed the same financial shape as the rest. Barbara supported him. The marriage ended. He left with a settlement. By now, the pattern had become the joke of 2 continents. Reporters covering her weddings had started keeping tallies in the margins of their copy. Friends stopped bothering to learn the new husband's name before he was already the ex-husband. Von Cramm, for his part, was one of the more sympathetic figures in the sequence. A genuinely gifted athlete whose career had been complicated by his own legal troubles in Nazi Germany years earlier, and his marriage to Barbara ran its course without the outright cruelty of Reventlow or the calculated exploitation of Rubirosa. It simply ended, the way most of them did, once the money had changed hands and the novelty had worn off. Husband number 7, the palace in Mexico. Her 7th and final marriage, in 1964, was to Prince Pierre Doan Vinh, a member by adoption of the royal family of Champasak in Laos. By this point in her life, the pattern of borrowed and adopted royalty had become almost a private ritual for Barbara, a repeated attempt to purchase the legitimacy her own American money had never quite bought her. She built him a $2 million palace in Jutepec, Mexico, modeled on a Japanese imperial retreat, and named Sumiya, after a courtesan's house in Kyoto. It had a Zen sand garden and a working kabuki theater, positioned deliberately so it could gaze at the nearby volcano Popocatépetl, the way its Japanese namesake gazed at Mount Fuji. The house survives today, converted decades later into a luxury hotel outside Cuernavaca, a strange physical monument to a 2-year marriage most guests who stay there have never heard of. The marriage lasted 2 years. They divorced in 1966. Barbara was 53 years old and had now been married and divorced 7 times, and the fortune that had once made her the most talked-about heiress in the world had been bled out, husband by husband, palace by palace, settlement by settlement. The downfall. Money wasn't the only thing draining out of Barbara Hutton in those later decades. Her health was collapsing under the weight of seconal dependency and the anorexia that had taken hold of her since her 20s, and by her 50s, people who hadn't seen her in years reported being shocked at how frail she'd become. Lance, meanwhile, had grown into an accomplished race car designer and driver in his own right, one of the few genuinely stable, self-made achievements to come out of anyone connected to this story. He'd inherited his mother's fortune-adjacent world, but built something of his own inside it, far from the marriages and the settlements. In 1972, the one relationship in Barbara's life that had never wavered, her son Lance, the boy she'd raised through the Reventlow divorce and every marriage after, ended when Lance died in a plane crash at 36 years old. Barbara was devastated in a way none of her 7 divorces had come close to matching. She had survived a violent marriage, a public suicide attempt, and the slow, humiliating drain of a $500 million fortune, and friends said none of it broke her the way her son's death did. Friends said she never fully recovered. She lived 7 more years after that, mostly alone, mostly at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel, selling off jewelry and possessions piece by piece to fund a lifestyle that had once required no funding at all. The Romanov jewels she'd acquired decades earlier, pieces with real royal provenance and real historical weight, went first. Then came the smaller pieces, the everyday extravagances, sold quietly through dealers who understood that discretion mattered more to her than price. Those who knew her in this period described a woman who still gave generously to strangers, who showed her even small kindnesses, even as her own accounts ran dry. The same reflexive, almost compulsive generosity that had funded 7 marriages, now funding tips and gifts to hotel staff and casual acquaintances who had no idea they were being handed money from a fortune that no longer existed in any meaningful way. By the time she died of a heart attack on May 11, 1979, at 66 years old, the figures circulating in the press put her remaining bank balance somewhere under $4,000. Some who knew her disputed that exact number as too dramatic for a woman who'd once controlled tens of millions, but nobody disputed the direction her fortune had traveled across 5 decades. She was buried at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, in the Woolworth family mausoleum, back among the relatives whose store counter fortune had shaped, and in the end consumed, her entire life. The store counters themselves were long gone by then too. The Woolworth chain that had built her family's empire would collapse into irrelevance within 2 more decades, and the last F.W. Woolworth store in America closed its doors in 1997. Of the roughly $50 million she'd inherited by 21, adjusted upward across decades of marriages, mansions, and jewelry sold at a loss, almost none of it remained. 7 men had taken turns spending the Woolworth fortune. Only one of them, Cary Grant, ever gave any of it back. What her life actually proves. It would be easy to tell this story as a cautionary tale about wealth, one more heiress undone by too much money and too little sense. That reading misses the actual shape of what happened to her. Barbara Hutton wasn't undone by having money. She was undone by never once, in 66 years, being loved by anyone who didn't also want it. Her butler told her that truth when she was 9 years old, and instead of protecting her from it, the adults around her spent the rest of her life proving him right. A father who handed off his daughter's upbringing but kept tight control of her trust fund. A society that mocked her for flaunting money she never chose to be born into. 6 husbands, one after another, who saw a fortune before they saw a person. The one husband who didn't, the one who left the marriage without asking for a settlement, is the one she's still remembered for today, decades after the Mdivanis and the Rubarosas and the counts and barons have faded into footnotes. That's not a coincidence. That's the whole story, distilled into a single divorce decree. Barbara Hutton was called the richest girl in the world before she was old enough to understand what that meant, and she died with less money than most working Americans have in a savings account. In between, she gave away a fortune to men who took it and left, searching, marriage after marriage, for the one thing her money had never been able to buy her. It's worth sitting with how young she was at each turn of this story. She was 5 when she found her mother's body, 18 when the country turned on her for a birthday party she didn't plan, 21 when the first husband arrived exactly on schedule, the moment the trust fund matured, 23 when a count's violence put her in a hospital bed. By the time most people are settling into a career and a stable adult life, Barbara Hutton had already lived through enough tragedy and betrayal to fill several lifetimes, and she still had 4 more marriages and 4 more decades left to go. None of this excuses the men who exploited her, and it shouldn't. Rubarosas calculated serial marriages to 2 of the era's richest women, Reventlow's violence, Mdivani's opportunism. These were choices men made, deliberately, against a woman whose entire life had trained her to expect exactly that treatment and to pay for it without complaint. But it also explains why she kept walking back into it. A person told at 9 years old that she would only ever be loved for her money tends, eventually, to stop expecting anything else, and to stop being surprised when the world confirms it. If Barbara Hutton's story hit you the way it hit me putting this together, there's a whole shelf of women like her waiting in this channel's back catalogue. Heiresses, first ladies, Hollywood wives, women the history books remember for their scandals instead of their pain. Their names get attached to jokes and nicknames long after anyone remembers what actually happened to them, and that's the gap we try to close here, one story at a time. Subscribe if you haven't, hit that bell so you don't miss the next one, and let me know in the comments which of her 7 husbands you'd want a full episode on. Reventlow's abuse, Rubirosa's serial exploitation of 2 of the era's richest women, or Cary Grant's strange, quiet decency, all deserve a deeper look on their own. And if you've made it this far, I'd genuinely like to know, out of everything in this one, was it the debutante ball, and the 7 husbands, or the son she lost that stuck with you most? Tell me below. Thanks for watching.